Sometimes the most powerful revenge comes wrapped in a wedding dress, served by someone the world taught to believe she wasn't enough. Lady Alira had spent her entire life being overlooked, dismissed as nothing more than an aging woman whose only value lay in her inheritance. Count Thalor thought he had found the perfect victim when he set his sights on her castle. This ancient vampire had spent centuries preying on the lonely and desperate. He believed Alira would be grateful for his attention, blind to his true nature. But on their wedding night, as he followed her into the castle's oldest chapel, he discovered his fatal mistake. The woman he thought was weak had been preparing for this moment her entire life. She spoke ancient words that bound him to holy ground as the sun began to rise. But how did a mortal woman outsmart a creature who had hunted for 1,000 years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The mist clung to Raven's Hollow Valley like a shroud that never lifted, wrapping itself around the ancient stones of Blackthorn Castle with the persistence of old secrets. Lady Alira stood at her chamber window, watching the grey tendrils curl through the bare branches of oak trees that had witnessed 5 centuries of her family's stewardship. At 35, she had grown accustomed to solitude, though it hadn't always been a choice. The castle itself bore the weight of countless winters, its towers reaching toward a sky that seemed perpetually overcast. Built upon a convergence of ley lines that the ancients had recognized as sacred, the fortress had served as more than mere shelter for the Blackthorn bloodline. Each stone had been blessed, each archway inscribed with protective symbols worn smooth by time, but never powerless. The very foundations hummed with an energy that made horses restless and sent birds wheeling away from the battlements. Alira's fingers traced the leather binding of the tome resting on her windowsill, the grimoire of House Blackthorn, passed down through 23 generations of women who had understood that some inheritances came with duties heavier than gold. The book's pages contained centuries of accumulated wisdom, detailed accounts of supernatural encounters, protective rituals that had saved countless lives, and the sacred obligations that bound each keeper to stand against the darkness. Her mother, Lady Evangeline, had carried these responsibilities until her death 3 years prior. The memory still ached like a wound that refused to heal. Evangeline had faced her final supernatural threat with the same quiet courage that had defined her life, but even the most prepared guardian could not escape every danger. She had fallen protecting a merchant caravan from creatures that fed on fear itself, leaving behind only her diary's final entry. The line continues, "Alira will be ready when her time comes." The castle's daily rhythms had become Alira's meditation. Each morning brought the same routine, checking the protective wards that lined the corridors, consulting the ancient texts for signs of approaching threats, and managing the practical concerns of a deteriorating estate that barely generated enough income to maintain itself. The irony wasn't lost on her that outsiders saw only a spinster struggling with finances, unaware that she commanded knowledge that could reshape their understanding of the world. Father Benedict emerged from the chapel courtyard below, his aging frame moving with the deliberate care of someone who had learned to respect the weight of years. He had served as the castle's chaplain for 4 decades, arriving as a young priest filled with conventional faith and gradually awakening to truths that his seminary had never prepared him to face. His sermons spoke of divine protection, but his private conversations with Alira delved into the practical applications of blessed silver and the precise pronunciation of binding words that could make the difference between salvation and catastrophe. "My lady," called Martha from the doorway, her voice carrying the comfortable familiarity of 3 decades of service. The housekeeper had witnessed more supernatural encounters than most scholars could imagine, yet she faced each day with the pragmatic acceptance that marked those born to serve extraordinary families. Thomas requests a word about the eastern pasture fence, says there's been unusual activity near the old stone circle. Alira nodded, closing the grimoire with reverent care. The stone circle predated even the castle, marking a site where druids had once performed rituals that kept darker powers at bay. If something was disturbing that ancient peace, it required immediate attention. The castle's interior reflected generations of careful stewardship balanced against gradual decline. Tapestries that had once blazed with color now showed the muted tones of age, while furniture bore the patina of centuries of use. Yet beneath this genteel decay lay hidden strengths. Crucifixes carved from wood, blessed by martyrs, mirrors backed with silver that revealed supernatural illusions, and doorways inscribed with protective symbols that turned away creatures of malice. Thomas waited in the stable courtyard, his weathered hands nervous as they cleaned a harness that needed no attention. The stable master had inherited his position from his father and grandfather before him, each generation learning to recognize signs that others missed. His horses possessed an uncanny ability to sense supernatural presences, their behavior serving as an early warning system that had prevented countless tragedies. "Begging your pardon, my lady, but it's the third night running that something's been circling the stones," Thomas reported, his eyes avoiding direct contact as tradition demanded when discussing matters beyond normal understanding. "The horses won't settle, and yesterday morning I found tracks that don't match any natural creature. Deep impressions, like something heavy, had been testing the ground around the perimeter." Alira felt the familiar weight of inherited responsibility settling across her shoulders. The stone circle's protections required regular renewal, but something powerful enough to probe its defenses represented a threat that demanded careful consideration. "Have you noticed any other changes? Unusual weather patterns, animals behaving strangely, anything that feels different?" "The crows have been gathering in larger numbers than usual," Thomas admitted. "And yesterday evening, I could have sworn I saw a figure watching the castle from the hill crest, but when I looked again, nothing was there. Could have been imagination, but it felt like being studied." The description sent a chill through Alira's carefully maintained composure. She had been expecting something like this for months, ever since her studies had revealed disturbing patterns in the supernatural activity throughout the region. Ancient powers were stirring, and threats that had slumbered for decades were beginning to test boundaries that had held for generations. That evening, Alira sat in her private study, surrounded by the accumulated wisdom of her ancestors. The chamber occupied the castle's highest tower, its windows offering commanding views of the valley, while its thick walls provided security for the most precious texts in her collection. Candles flickered in iron sconces, their flames dancing in response to drafts that spoke of the ancient building's countless hidden passages and forgotten chambers. The grimoire lay open before her, its pages revealing accounts of vampires, shapeshifters, and creatures whose names had been forgotten by all but the most dedicated guardians. Each entry detailed not only the threat each creature represented, but also the methods by which they could be contained or destroyed. Her mother's careful annotations filled the margins, adding practical experience to theoretical knowledge. A passage caught her attention, describing a vampire lord who had terrorized the region nearly 2 centuries earlier. Count Valdris had possessed unusual cunning, preferring psychological manipulation to brute force as he established control over human communities. He had been finally trapped through a combination of sacred bindings and his own overconfidence, lured into a consecrated space where his powers could not protect him from the rising sun. The account detailed the specific rituals used to create the trap, including the wedding ring of binding that had been crafted for that purpose. The ring remained hidden within the castle's most sacred vault, waiting for the day when another vampire might threaten the valley's peace. According to the grimoire, the ring could only be used by a woman of the bloodline, and only in circumstances where genuine sacrifice was required to activate its power. Alira's fingers unconsciously moved to her throat, where a simple silver chain held a pendant that had belonged to her mother. The moonstone pendant of true sight allowed its wearer to see through supernatural illusions, revealing the true nature of otherworldly beings, regardless of whatever disguises they might employ. It had saved Evangeline's life on multiple occasions, and Alira never removed it, understanding that protection often came from preparation rather than power. The wind picked up outside, sending tree branches scraping against the tower's stone walls with sounds that resembled claws testing for weakness. Alira closed the grimoire and moved to her window, gazing out at the valley where mist obscured the details of familiar landmarks. Somewhere in that darkness, something was watching and waiting, planning an approach that would test every lesson she had learned from 20 generations of guardians. She thought of her mother's final words, written in the diary's last entry, with handwriting that grew increasingly unsteady as exhaustion overtook determination. Evangeline had faced her end, knowing that her daughter possessed both the knowledge and the courage necessary to continue their family's sacred mission. But knowledge without experience was a fragile shield, and Alira wondered whether she would prove worthy of the trust that had been placed in her keeping. The castle settled around her with the creaks and sighs of old wood and ancient stone adjusting to another night's vigil. Each sound was familiar, part of a symphony she had been hearing since childhood, but tonight she listened with heightened awareness for anything that didn't belong. The protective wards hummed their silent song of defense, while the blessed silver hidden throughout the building waited to serve its purpose when the time came. Father Benedict's evening prayers echoed faintly from the Everno, the chapel below, his voice carrying words of protection that strengthened the barriers between the sacred and the profane. Martha's footsteps moved through the corridors as she completed her final rounds, checking locks and ensuring that every protective measure remained in place. Thomas would be making his own circuit of the stables and grounds, his experienced eyes alert for signs that only those born to serve extraordinary households would recognize. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight offered a few more hours of preparation and peace. Alira returned to her studies, knowing that somewhere in these accumulated pages lay the knowledge she would need to face whatever darkness was gathering beyond her valley's borders. The autumn market fair brought the first excitement Ravenshollow Valley had seen in months, drawing merchants and travelers from villages that rarely ventured beyond their own borders. Colourful pavilions dotted the village green, while the scents of roasted meat and honeyed pastries mingled with the crisp air that promised winter's approach. For one day, the perpetual mist seemed to lift its oppressive weight, allowing genuine laughter to echo between the ancient stone buildings. Alira moved through the crowd with the careful grace of someone accustomed to being noticed for all the wrong reasons. Her practical woolen dress marked her status without ostentation, while the silver pendant at her throat caught occasional glints of sunlight that made her appear more ethereal than the gossips usually allowed. She had come to purchase winter supplies and herbs that Father Benedict required for his more specialized blessings, but found herself pausing at a merchant's stall displaying curious artifacts. The trader was a thin man with nervous eyes who claimed his wares came from estate sales across the northern counties. Among the usual collection of tarnished jewelry and worn books sat an object that made Alira's pendant grow cold against her. Skin, a chalice carved from black stone and inlaid with rubies that seemed to pulse with their own inner fire. The crimson chalice of Thalor, though she didn't yet know its name, radiated a malevolence that made her step backward instinctively. "A beautiful piece, is it not?" The voice came from directly behind her, smooth and cultured with an accent that suggested education and breeding. "Though I suspect it carries a history that would disturb most collectors." Alira turned to find herself facing a man who seemed to embody everything the valley lacked: sophistication, wealth, and the kind of confident bearing that commanded attention effortlessly. Count Thalor appeared to be perhaps 40 years of age, with dark hair touched by distinguished silver and eyes the color of deep burgundy wine. His traveling clothes were of the finest quality, cut in a style that suggested familiarity with royal courts, while his manner conveyed the easy authority of someone accustomed to having his wishes granted without question. "My lord," Alira offered a respectful curtsy, though her pendant's chill warned her that this encounter held significance beyond mere courtesy. "I was merely admiring the craftsmanship, though I confess the piece troubles me in ways I cannot easily explain." Thalor's smile revealed teeth that seemed unusually white and sharp, though the expression appeared genuinely pleased rather than predatory. "You possess remarkable sensitivity to appreciate nuances that escape most observers." "I am Count Thalor of Ravencrest, recently arrived from the northern estates to explore opportunities in this charming valley. Might I be so bold as to request an introduction?" "Lady Alira of Blackthorn Castle," she replied, studying his face while her training catalogued details that others would miss. His skin possessed an unusual pallor despite his claims of recent travel, while his movements carried a fluid grace that suggested strength carefully concealed beneath. Cultured refinement. Most tellingly, the merchant's nervous disposition had intensified dramatically since the Count's arrival, though Thalor seemed unaware of the effect his presence created. "Blackthorn Castle," Thalor repeated, his burgundy eyes brightening with what appeared to be genuine interest. "I have heard tales of your family's long stewardship over this valley, a responsibility passed down through how many generations?" The question's specificity triggered warning signals that Alira had been trained to recognize since childhood. Casual travelers rarely knew enough about local history to frame such inquiries, particularly regarding bloodlines and inheritance. "My family has been blessed to serve this community for many years, my lord. Are you perhaps interested in local history? I find that understanding a region's past provides valuable insight into its future potential." Thalor replied smoothly, though his gaze had sharpened in ways that made Alira's pendant positively frigid. "Your castle, for instance, occupies a most strategic position overlooking the valley's primary trade routes, built upon foundations that I suspect are far older than the current structure." The conversation was proceeding exactly as the grimoire's warnings had described, a supernatural predator probing for weaknesses while maintaining the pretense of social courtesy. Alira forced herself to respond with the demeanor expected of a lonely woman, grateful for aristocratic attention, though every instinct screamed danger. "Indeed, my lord, the site has been occupied for centuries beyond memory. Some claim the stones themselves possess unusual properties, though I place little credence in such superstitions." The lie came easily, delivered with the self-deprecating tone that encouraged others to underestimate her knowledge. Thalor's expression suggested he found her modesty charming rather than convincing, but he maintained the fiction that their conversation involved nothing more than polite interest. "Perhaps you would honor me with a tour of your remarkable castle. I confess myself fascinated by medieval architecture, particularly structures that have been maintained with such obvious care." The invitation she had been expecting, delivered with perfect courtesy and underlying compulsion that would have overwhelmed a truly unprepared victim. Alira felt the weight of her mother's training settling around her like armor, each lesson recalled and every contingency considered in the space between heartbeats. "I would be delighted to receive such a distinguished visitor, my lord, though I must warn you that the castle offers little in the way of modern comforts. We maintain the old ways, perhaps to a fault." Another carefully crafted truth that would appeal to his assessment of her as a helpless traditionalist, while actually describing defenses he could not yet comprehend. Their conversation continued through the afternoon as Thalor demonstrated the practiced charm of centuries spent manipulating human emotions. He spoke eloquently of his travels, his appreciation for historical preservation, and his growing desire to establish a permanent estate in a region blessed with natural beauty and enlightened stewardship. Each word was calculated to appeal to a woman whose isolation had made her vulnerable to sophisticated attention. But beneath his performance, Alira detected signs that confirmed her worst suspicions. He cast no reflection in the polished surfaces of the merchant's silver plates. His shadow fell at angles that defied the sun's position. Most damning of all, the blessed pendant at her throat grew colder with each word he spoke, until the silver felt like ice against her skin. As evening approached and the market fair prepared to close, Thalor extended the invitation she had been anticipating since their first exchange. "Lady Alira, I wonder if you might consider allowing me to call upon you in the coming days. I find myself reluctant to conclude such a delightful conversation, and your insights into the valley's history prove most enlightening. You honor me with such attention." "My lord," Alira replied, her voice carrying just the right note of feminine gratitude that would reinforce his assumptions about her character. "Though I confess myself puzzled by your interest in the observations of a countrywoman whose experience extends little beyond these valley walls. Wisdom often flourishes in unexpected places," Thalor observed, his burgundy gaze holding hers with intensity that would have been mesmerizing if she hadn't recognized it as supernatural compulsion. "I suspect you possess depths that would surprise those who know you only superficially." The irony of his words might have amused her under different circumstances, but Alira maintained her carefully constructed persona while her mind raced through the preparations that would be necessary for what was coming. If this creature intended to claim her castle and her blood, he would discover that the last keeper of ancient knowledge had inherited more than just musty books and crumbling stones. They parted with formal courtesies that masked the deadly game now beginning between them. Thalor promised to call within the week, while Alira graciously accepted his attention with the air of a woman grateful for any respite from lonely spinsterhood. Neither acknowledged the true nature of their encounter, though both understood that their next meeting would determine whether the valley's centuries of protection would continue or finally fall to darkness. As Alira made her way home through lengthening shadows, her pendant gradually warmed to its normal temperature, though the memory of its icy warning remained vivid in her thoughts. The grimoire had prepared her for this moment, but facing a vampire lord in person proved different from studying theoretical accounts in the safety of her tower chamber. The game was now afoot, with stakes that extended far beyond her personal survival. Everything her family had built and protected for 23 generations depended on her ability to play her role convincingly while preparing for a confrontation that would test every lesson she had learned about the eternal war between light and darkness. Count Thalor arrived at Blackthorn Castle 3 days later, his approach announced by the restless stamping of Thomas's horses and an unnatural silence that settled over the valley like a held breath. Alira watched from her tower window as his elegant carriage navigated the winding path, noting how the morning mist seemed to follow in his wake despite the clear sunshine that blessed the surrounding countryside. She had spent every hour since their meeting in careful preparation, consulting the grimoire's most detailed passages, while Father Benedict helped her strengthen the castle's protective barriers. The ancient wards had been refreshed with blessed salt and silver dust, while specific chambers had received additional consecration that would prove crucial when the time came for action. "The silver has been polished and placed according to your mother's instructions," Martha reported as she helped Alira into her finest receiving dress. The housekeeper's steady demeanor masked an underlying tension that spoke of her awareness that this visit represented something far more dangerous than social courtesy. Father Benedict completed the chapel preparations at dawn, and Thomas has ensured that all the protective symbols remain undisturbed. Alira nodded, grateful for the loyalty of servants who asked no questions while providing everything necessary for the supernatural battle ahead. Her reflection in the mirror showed a woman dressed to receive an honored guest, though the silver pendant at her throat and the blessed rings on her fingers told a different story to those who understood their significance. The sanctified dagger of Saint Erasmus rested in its hidden sheath within the altar, its silver blade blessed by a martyr and capable of harming creatures that laughed at mortal weapons. Father Benedict had spent the previous evening in prayer over the weapon, renewing benedictions that had protected the valley for generations while preparing for their possible use in the coming confrontation. Thalor's formal greeting exceeded even aristocratic expectations, his manner combining perfect courtesy with an underlying intensity that made the air seem to crackle with suppressed energy. He brought gifts appropriate to his apparent station, rare books from northern libraries, exotic spices from distant markets, and jewelry that gleamed with suspicious perfection in the castle's ancient chambers. "Lady Alira, your castle proves even more remarkable than I had imagined," he declared, as she led him through corridors lined with tapestries that concealed protective symbols woven into their very fabric. The stonework displays craftsmanship that speaks of builders who understood principles lost to modern architects. His assessment was more accurate than he could know, though Alira maintained her pose as a gracious hostess, pleased by his appreciation. "My ancestors chose their builders well, though I confess myself unable to appreciate the technical details that clearly fascinate you, my lord." They moved through chambers where centuries of careful stewardship had preserved both beauty and function, though Thalor's experienced eye clearly detected elements that transcended mere decoration. His fingers traced door frames, carved with symbols that appeared ornamental but served to turn away malevolent influences, while his gaze lingered on mirrors whose silver backing had been blessed by priests who understood the true nature of evil. "Your family's dedication to preservation extends beyond mere antiquarian interest," Thalor observed, his burgundy eyes holding hers with an intensity that would have been overwhelming without her protective training. "These halls whisper of traditions maintained through generations that understood their true significance." The compliment carried layers of meaning that confirmed her assessment of his supernatural nature while revealing the extent of his knowledge about the valley's hidden protections. He recognized the castle's defenses while calculating their weaknesses, his centuries of experience allowing him to appreciate obstacles that would challenge, but not ultimately defeat, his intentions. Father Benedict joined them for the midday meal, his presence adding another layer of protection while providing an opportunity to observe their visitors' reactions to direct spiritual authority. The elderly priest maintained perfect courtesy while delivering subtle tests that only someone familiar with supernatural threats would recognize or understand. "Count Thalor, your travels must have exposed you to many fascinating regional customs," Father Benedict remarked as he offered a blessing over their meal. "I find that older traditions often preserve wisdom that modern society has forgotten in its rush toward progress." Thalor accepted the blessing with apparent grace, though Alira noticed how he avoided direct contact with the blessed bread and wine that formed the meal's centerpiece. "Indeed, Father, though I confess myself sometimes startled by the persistence of beliefs that rational minds might dismiss as mere superstition." The exchange continued throughout the afternoon as both sides probed for advantage while maintaining the fiction of social courtesy. Thalor demonstrated knowledge that exceeded normal human experience, while Father Benedict revealed depths of understanding that went far beyond conventional theology. Alira played her role as the gracious hostess caught between two fascinating men, though her pendant grew steadily colder as evening approached. As sunset painted the valley in shades of gold and crimson, Thalor requested permission to tour the castle's grounds, expressing particular interest in the ancient chapel that crowned the highest hill. His request came as no surprise, since the grimoire had warned that vampires were invariably drawn to sacred spaces they sought to corrupt or claim. "The chapel holds special significance for my family," Alira explained, as they walked the moonlit path between towering oak trees whose branches seemed to whisper warnings in the evening breeze. Each generation has added their own contributions to its beauty and sanctity. The building that emerged from the shadows exceeded even Thalor's apparent expectations. Its Gothic architecture, speaking of builders who had understood both earthly and spiritual principles. Gargoyles perched on the corners served purposes beyond mere decoration, while the stained glass windows displayed scenes that told stories of victory over darkness in forms both symbolic and literal. Thalor paused at the chapel's threshold, his expression shifting subtly as he encountered barriers that most visitors never noticed. The blessed stones hummed with protective energy that made his supernatural senses recoil, while the silver inlaid throughout the structure created a network of defenses that would challenge even his considerable powers. "Remarkable craftsmanship," he murmured, though his voice carried notes of calculation that revealed his true assessment of what he faced. "Your ancestors clearly spared no expense in creating a worthy monument to their faith. They understood that some investments transcended mere earthly concerns," Alira replied, her words carrying their own layers of meaning as she watched his reaction to the chapel's spiritual defenses. Faith, when properly grounded, creates foundations that endure long after those who built them have passed into memory. Their conversation continued as darkness settled over the valley, each exchange deepening the game of deception and revelation that would ultimately determine whether the castle's protections would hold or fall. Thalor's courtship proceeded with calculated precision, his centuries of experience allowing him to present exactly the combination of sophistication and attention that would appeal to a woman whose isolation had made her vulnerable to skilled manipulation. But beneath his performance, Alira detected growing hunger and impatience that spoke of his true nature asserting itself despite his careful control. The vampire lord was beginning to reveal the predator beneath his aristocratic mask, and their next encounter would test whether her preparations had been sufficient to meet the challenge that was coming. The weeks that followed brought a courtship that would have appeared romantic to any observer unaware of its true nature. Count Thalor arrived each evening at sunset, his timing so precise that Martha began setting the table without awaiting formal announcement. His gifts grew more elaborate with each visit, ancient manuscripts that spoke of forgotten arts, jeweled ornaments that gleamed with suspicious perfection, and wine that tasted of centuries-old cellars where no mortal feet had walked. Alira played her role with increasing skill, allowing herself to appear gradually enchanted by his sophisticated attention, while secretly cataloguing every detail that confirmed her growing certainty about his supernatural identity. The moonstone pendant of true sight revealed glimpses of his actual form during unguarded moments, skin that bore the pallor of centuries without sunlight, eyes that occasionally flashed with predatory hunger, and movements that carried the fluid grace of something that had transcended human limitations long ago. Father Benedict observed their developing relationship with carefully concealed concern, his evening prayers growing longer and more fervent as he strengthened the spiritual barriers that protected both the castle and its inhabitants. The elderly priest had lived long enough to recognize the signs of supernatural courtship, though he trusted Alira's judgment while preparing for whatever confrontation was approaching. "The Count seems quite taken with our valley's charms," Father Benedict remarked one evening as he and Alira reviewed the ancient texts that detailed vampire behavior and weaknesses. His questions about local history demonstrate unusual interest in matters that most visitors ignore. Alira nodded, her fingers tracing passages in the grimoire that described the specific techniques vampires use to establish territorial control. He asks particularly pointed questions about the castle's foundations and the chapel's consecration. Yesterday, he inquired about the frequency of our evening prayers and the specific saints to whom we maintain devotion. The priest's weathered face grew grave as he considered the implications. Such questions suggest he's testing our defenses rather than merely expressing polite curiosity. Have you given thought to how you intend to proceed when he inevitably proposes marriage? The question had haunted Alira's thoughts since their first meeting, though the grimoire provided detailed guidance for exactly this situation. According to her ancestors' carefully recorded experiences, vampires of Thalor's sophistication preferred legal claim to their territory, viewing marriage as both strategic advantage and symbolic conquest. The binding rituals described in the family texts could only be performed during a wedding ceremony conducted on consecrated ground, making the chapel's sanctuary the perfect stage for the trap she was preparing. "The wedding ring of binding remains hidden in the vault beneath the altar," Alira replied quietly. "Mother's notes indicate that it can only be activated by a bride who willingly accepts the supernatural consequences of the ritual. The vampire must believe himself the predator until the moment the sacred words transform hunter into prey." Their conversation was interrupted by Thomas's arrival, the stable master's expression carrying the controlled urgency that marked supernatural emergencies. "My lady, begging your pardon, but something has been testing the boundaries again. Found tracks this morning that circle the entire castle grounds, like something was measuring the extent of our protections." The news confirmed Alira's growing suspicion that Thalor's courtship was accelerating toward its inevitable conclusion. Vampires rarely maintained deceptions longer than necessary, their predatory nature eventually demanding action regardless of strategic considerations. His increasingly bold questions and the lengthening duration of his visits suggested that patience was wearing thin beneath his cultivated facade. That evening brought the proposal she had been expecting, delivered with theatrical perfection in the castle's rose garden as moonlight painted the ancient stones in silver radiance. Thalor dropped to one knee with practiced grace, presenting a ring that gleamed with diamonds, arranged in patterns that hurt to contemplate directly. "Lady Alira, these past weeks have revealed to me a depth of character and intelligence that I had despaired of ever finding," he declared, his burgundy eyes holding hers with compelling intensity. "Would you honor me by accepting my hand in marriage and joining your noble heritage to mine?" The ring itself radiated malevolence that made her pendant burn with cold fire, its gems arranged in configurations that served purposes beyond mere decoration. Ancient symbols worked into the metal suggested binding of a different sort than what Christian ceremony typically implied, while the overall design spoke of ownership rather than partnership. "My lord, you honor me beyond my worthiest dreams," Alira replied, her voice carrying exactly the right note of overwhelmed gratitude, while her trained mind catalogued the supernatural elements hidden within his offering. "Though I confess myself hardly worthy of such distinguished attention from someone of your obvious refinement and worldly experience." Thalor's smile revealed teeth that seemed sharper in the moonlight, though his manner remained that of a devoted suitor rather than a predator closing in for the kill. "Your modesty only increases my admiration, though I suspect you possess qualities that would surprise those who know you only superficially." The irony of his words might have been amusing under different circumstances, but Alira maintained her role while accepting the cursed ring that would serve as another layer of protection when the binding ritual reached its culmination. The blessed silver of her family's artifacts would neutralize whatever dark enchantments Thalor had woven into the jewelry, turning his own weapons against him when the proper time arrived. They agreed upon a wedding date only 3 weeks hence, the urgency driven by Thalor's claim that business obligations would soon require his departure from the valley. His impatience confirmed Alira's assessment that his supernatural nature was asserting itself despite his careful planning, hunger, and territorial instinct overriding the caution that had kept him alive for centuries. The following days brought a flurry of wedding preparations that concealed the more crucial arrangements taking place beneath the surface of normal activity. Father Benedict consecrated the chapel with renewed intensity, his prayers strengthening barriers that would prove essential when sacred ground became the stage for supernatural confrontation. Martha gathered the specific herbs and blessed oils that the binding ritual required, while Thomas ensured that every protective symbol throughout the castle grounds remained undisturbed and properly maintained. Alira spent her days playing the role of a bride consumed with wedding preparations, while her evenings were devoted to memorizing the ancient words that would transform celebration into trap. The grimoire's most crucial passages had been copied and hidden where they could be accessed during the ceremony, though the success of everything depended on her ability to recite the binding incantations without error, while maintaining the pretense that she remained an unsuspecting victim. As the wedding date approached, the valley itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of the confrontation that would determine whether centuries of protection would continue or finally surrender to ancient darkness. The wedding ceremony unfolded with deceptive tranquility as autumn sunset painted the chapel's stained glass windows in shades of amber and crimson. Father Benedict's voice carried across the ancient stones with practiced authority, though Alira detected the subtle variations in his liturgy that invoked protections beyond those found in standard wedding rites. The gathered witnesses, Martha, Thomas, and a handful of village elders, created the appearance of normal celebration while serving as additional anchors for the sacred energies that would soon be tested. Count Thalor stood at the altar with aristocratic composure, his burgundy eyes reflecting the candlelight in ways that seemed to burn with their own inner fire. His wedding attire was magnificent by any standard, cut from fabrics that whispered of wealth and position, though Alira's enhanced perception revealed details that confirmed her most dire suspicions. The threads themselves seemed to move independently in patterns too subtle for normal vision, while his shadow fell at angles that defied the chapel's carefully arranged illumination. The chronicle stone of memory stood silent beside the altar, its ancient carved surface recording every word and gesture for future generations who might need to understand what transpired within these consecrated walls. The pillar had witnessed 23 generations of blackthorn ceremonies, each one adding layers of spiritual significance to the foundation that would either hold or crumble beneath the supernatural forces now gathering. Alira wore her mother's wedding gown, the ivory silk carefully altered to accommodate both her figure and the hidden protective elements that the coming ritual would require. Blessed silver threads had been woven into the fabric in patterns that appeared decorative but served to channel and focus the energies that binding ceremonies demanded. The wedding ring of binding waited in Father Benedict's vestment pocket, its ancient silver inscribed with runes that had been crafted specifically for this moment by smiths who understood both metallurgy and metaphysics. "Do you, Count Thalor of Ravencrest, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Father Benedict's question carried the weight of centuries, though the words that followed deviated from traditional liturgy in ways that only Alira fully understood. The priest was invoking ancient forms that bound supernatural beings to their sworn oaths, creating spiritual chains that would prove stronger than any physical restraint. "I do," Thalor replied, his voice carrying undertones of triumph that revealed his certainty that this ceremony marked his complete victory over the valley's protections. He believed himself on the verge of claiming not merely a bride, but dominion over sacred ground that had defied supernatural conquest for generations. The exchange of rings proceeded with ceremonial precision, though the moment when Alira received the wedding ring of binding marked the activation of forces that had slumbered for nearly 2 centuries. The silver band settled around her finger with weight that seemed to exceed its physical mass, while the ancient runes began to glow with light, visible only to those who possessed the sight to perceive supernatural energies at work. Father Benedict's final pronouncement declared them husband and wife, according to laws both earthly and spiritual, though the true significance of his words lay in the binding clauses hidden within traditional phrasing. As the ceremony concluded with apparent normalcy, Alira felt the first stirrings of power that would soon transform celebration into confrontation. The wedding feast that followed maintained the fiction that this was merely a joyful union between two people who had found love in an isolated valley. Thalor played his role with consummate skill, demonstrating the charm and sophistication that had convinced countless victims to trust him throughout his long existence. His conversation sparkled with wit and learning, while his attention to Alira suggested genuine devotion rather than calculated predation. But beneath the surface performance, supernatural tension mounted with each passing moment. The blessed elements, hidden throughout the chapel, began to resonate with increasing intensity as the wedding ring of binding drew power from the sacred ground beneath their feet. Thalor's careful composure showed subtle cracks as his enhanced senses detected energies that shouldn't exist within his carefully mapped understanding of the castle's defenses. "My dear," he murmured to Alira during a quiet moment between toasts, his burgundy eyes holding hers with compelling intensity. "I confess myself eager to begin our new life together. Perhaps we might retire to more private chambers where we can properly celebrate this momentous occasion." The invitation she had been expecting, delivered with perfect courtesy that barely concealed predatory hunger, finally asserting itself over strategic patience. According to the grimoire's detailed accounts, vampires of Thalor's sophistication typically claimed their brides in locations that held spiritual significance, viewing the corruption of sacred space as essential to establishing complete territorial control. "I would be honored to share with you the chapel's most sacred chambers," Alira replied, her words carrying layers of meaning that would only become apparent when the binding ritual reached its culmination. "There are family traditions that must be observed on such occasions, though I confess them perhaps old-fashioned by modern standards." Thalor's smile suggested he found her adherence to tradition charming rather than threatening, his centuries of experience having taught him that human customs rarely posed actual obstacles to determined supernatural predators. He had no way of knowing that these particular traditions had been specifically designed to trap creatures exactly like him. As the wedding guests departed with expressions of joy and blessing, Father Benedict offered final prayers that strengthened the spiritual barriers surrounding the chapel, while ensuring that the chronicle stone would preserve accurate records of whatever followed. Martha and Thomas took their positions at carefully calculated distances, ready to provide assistance while remaining safely outside the zone where supernatural forces would soon clash with devastating intensity. The chapel's interior grew silent as Alira led her new husband toward the altar where generations of her ancestors had performed rituals that protected the valley from threats that most people never suspected existed. The wedding ring of binding pulsed with increasing warmth as they approached the chronicle stone, its ancient runes beginning to glow with light that cast dancing shadows across the Gothic arches above. Thalor followed willingly, his predatory confidence masking growing unease as his supernatural senses detected energies that exceeded his careful assessment of the chapel's defenses. The vampire lord believed himself moments away from claiming both bride and territory, unaware that he was walking into a trap that had been centuries in the making. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether the last keeper of ancient knowledge possessed the courage and skill necessary to honor her family's sacred obligations, or whether darkness would finally claim victory over protections that had endured since time beyond memory. The chapel's inner sanctum opened before them like a portal between worlds, its Gothic architecture reaching toward shadows that seemed to pulse with their own mysterious life. Alira guided Thalor through the archway that separated the main chapel from the sacred chamber where her ancestors had performed their most crucial rituals, each step bringing them closer to the confrontation that would determine the valley's fate for generations to come. The tiers of seraphim embedded within the altar caught the candlelight and transformed it into something approaching divine radiance, their crystalline surfaces reflecting illumination that seemed to emanate from sources beyond the physical realm. These sacred crystals had been blessed by martyrs and sanctified through centuries of prayer, their presence creating an impenetrable barrier against creatures of darkness who sought to corrupt holy ground. Thalor paused at the threshold, his supernatural senses recoiling from energies that exceeded his careful assessment of the chapel's defenses. "Remarkable craftsmanship," he murmured, though his burgundy eyes had begun to narrow with calculation rather than appreciation. "Your ancestors clearly understood principles that modern builders have forgotten. They believed that some spaces required protection beyond what mortal hands could provide," Alira replied, her voice carrying the first hints of the knowledge she had kept hidden throughout their courtship. Each stone was blessed, each symbol carved with purpose that transcended mere decoration. As they crossed into the sanctum proper, the wedding ring of binding began to pulse with increasing intensity, its ancient runes responding to proximity with the tiers of seraphim. The interaction between artifacts created a web of spiritual energy that would soon make escape impossible for any supernatural being caught within its influence. Thalor's confident demeanor showed the first cracks as his enhanced perception detected the true nature of what surrounded them. The chamber wasn't merely consecrated, it had been specifically designed as a trap for creatures like himself, with every architectural element serving to channel and focus spiritual forces that could bind even the most powerful vampire. "My dear bride," he said, his voice carrying new undertones of compulsion that would have overwhelmed an unprepared victim, "I confess myself curious about these family traditions you mentioned. Perhaps you would enlighten me about the customs that require such elaborate surroundings." The attempt at mental domination washed over Alira without effect, her years of training and the protective artifacts she wore rendering his influence powerless against her will. Instead of succumbing to supernatural coercion, she began speaking words in the ancient tongue that her mother had taught her, syllables that had been passed down through 23 generations of women who understood their true significance. "By the binding of silver, blessed and sacred ground, consecrated by the power of blood given freely and oaths sworn in divine presence," Alira intoned, her voice growing stronger with each phrase as the wedding ring of binding responded to the ritual's activation. "I call upon the covenant that binds hunter to sacred law and predator to holy justice." Thalor's aristocratic mask finally shattered as he recognized the nature of the trap closing around him. His attempt to reach the sanctum's exit met an invisible barrier created by the tiers of seraphim, while the binding energy radiating from Alira's ring began to restrict his supernatural abilities with increasing effectiveness. "Clever little mortal," he snarled, his cultured voice transforming into something that revealed centuries of predatory hunger. "Did you truly believe that ancient tricks could contain one who has walked in darkness since before your bloodline existed?" His form began to shift as supernatural power asserted itself over human disguise, revealing glimpses of the creature that had terrorized countless victims throughout his immortal existence. Fangs extended from his grinning mouth while his burgundy eyes blazed with fury that promised terrible retribution for this unexpected defiance. But the binding ritual had progressed too far to be stopped by threats or supernatural intimidation. The ancient words continued to flow from Alira's lips as she drew upon knowledge that had been preserved specifically for this moment, each phrase strengthening the spiritual chains that held him captive within the sanctum's blessed confines. "You underestimate both my heritage and my preparation," Alira replied, her voice steady despite facing a vampire lord in the full fury of his supernatural rage. "This chamber has contained creatures far older and more powerful than you, and their attempts to escape only strengthened the bonds that now hold you. The chronicle stone in the main chapel began to glow with increasing intensity as it recorded every detail of the confrontation, its mystical properties, ensuring that future generations would understand exactly how the binding had been accomplished. The artifact's activation sent waves of spiritual energy throughout the castle, alerting Father Benedict and the others that the crucial moment had finally arrived. Thalor's attempts to break free grew increasingly desperate as he discovered the true extent of the trap's sophistication. The tears of seraphim created barriers that even his centuries of accumulated power could not penetrate, while the wedding ring of binding drew upon the sacred ground beneath their feet to fuel spiritual chains that tightened with every moment that passed. "Your mother thought herself clever as well," Thalor revealed, his words carrying venom, intended to shatter Alira's concentration. She died believing that her sacrifice would protect this valley, unaware that her death only delayed the inevitable conquest. The revelation struck Alira like a physical blow, confirming her worst fears about the circumstances surrounding her mother's death, while revealing that this confrontation had been planned for years rather than weeks. Thalor had been probing the valley's defenses long before his apparent arrival, studying the Blackthorn bloodline and waiting for the moment when the last guardian would be vulnerable to his approach. But instead of weakening her resolve, the knowledge that her mother had died fighting this very creature only strengthened Alira's determination to honor the sacred obligations that had been passed down through generations of women who understood their true purpose. The binding ritual continued with renewed intensity as she channeled both her own training and her mother's sacrifice into the spiritual, forces that would either save or damn them both. Dawn was approaching, its light beginning to filter through the stained glass windows in rays that would prove fatal to any vampire caught within their reach. The race between supernatural binding and natural sunrise had begun, with the valley's fate hanging in the balance as ancient darkness struggled against protections that had endured for centuries. The binding ritual reached its crescendo as supernatural forces clashed within the sanctum's consecrated walls. But Thalor's next words shattered everything Alira had believed about her family's history and her own identity. "Your mother didn't die fighting me, foolish child," he declared, his voice carrying a complexity of emotion that transcended mere predatory rage. "Evangeline died protecting me from those who would have destroyed us both for the crime of loving across the boundaries that separate mortal from immortal. The heart's compass of eternal truth materialized between them as the ancient artifact responded to the intensity of supernatural forces within the sanctum. The mystical device appeared as a crystalline compass whose needle pointed not toward magnetic north but toward absolute honesty, its presence forcing both participants to confront truths they had hidden even from themselves. Alira's concentration wavered as Thalor's revelation struck at the foundations of everything she had been taught. "You lie," she whispered, though the heart's compass glowed with radiance that confirmed the impossible truth of his words. "My mother died protecting the valley from vampires like you." "Look deeper into your mother's private journals," Thalor commanded, his burgundy eyes holding hers with desperate intensity. "Read the passages she never meant for you to discover. Evangeline didn't die hunting monsters. She died as my beloved, sacrificing herself to save me from vampire hunters who had tracked us to this valley." The binding ritual continued, automatically as Alira's trained reflexes maintained the ancient words, but her mind reeled as fragments of suppressed memory began to surface. Her mother's unexplained absences during certain phases of the moon, the way Evangeline's eyes had grown distant when discussing particular supernatural threats, most tellingly, the tenderness in her voice when she spoke of creatures who had found redemption despite their dark nature. "The protection you wear around your neck," Thalor continued, his supernatural strength straining against bonds that held him captive, "was forged from silver, I gave your mother as a token of love that transcended the boundaries between our kinds. Touch it now and feel the truth that she died rather than reveal." Alira's fingers moved involuntarily to the moonstone pendant of true sight, and the moment her skin contacted the familiar silver, visions flooded her consciousness with devastating clarity. She saw her mother in Thalor's arms beneath moonlight that painted them both in ethereal radiance. She witnessed tender moments between mortal guardian and immortal protector as they found in each other a love that neither had believed possible. Most shocking of all, she saw the moment of her own conception, not through violation or supernatural compulsion, but through genuine passion between beings who had chosen love over the ancient hatreds that divided their kinds. "No," Alira breathed, though the heart's compass blazed with light that confirmed every impossible detail. "I am human. I am a guardian of the Blackthorn bloodline, sworn to protect this valley from creatures like you." "You are both and neither," Thalor replied, his voice carrying centuries of grief and longing. "The child of a love that should have been impossible, bearing within your mortal frame the dormant potential of both your heritages. Your mother died, believing that secret should die with her, but the vampire hunters who killed her suspected the truth. The 22 binding ritual faltered as Alira struggled to process revelations that overturned her entire understanding of her identity and purpose. The wedding ring of binding pulsed with confused energy, uncertain whether it should contain a vampire lord or protect a being who carried both mortal and immortal blood within her veins. "Why didn't she tell me?" Alira demanded, tears streaming down her cheeks as she confronted the magnitude of her mother's deception. "Why let me believe I was something I'm not? Because the truth would have made you a target for those who hunt supernatural beings, regardless of their nature," Thalor explained, his own voice breaking with emotion as he remembered the woman who had sacrificed everything for love. "Evangeline died, protecting not just me, but the secret of what you could become if you ever learned to embrace both sides of your heritage." The heart's compass revealed layer after layer of hidden truth as its influence forced absolute honesty from both participants. Alira saw how her unusual sensitivity to supernatural presence stemmed not from training, but from inherited ability. She understood why blessed silver never burned her skin, and why vampire compulsion had no power over her will. Most devastating of all, she realized that her attraction to Thalor hadn't been mere feminine loneliness or calculated deception, but recognition of her own supernatural nature, calling to its counterpart across the divide that separated mortal from immortal. "The binding ritual," she gasped as understanding dawned with terrible clarity. "It's not designed to trap you, it's meant to awaken the dormant vampire blood in my own veins." Thalor nodded, his expression mixing hope and terror as he watched her confront the truth that would transform everything. "The wedding ring of binding was created by your ancestors, not to contain vampires, but to safely trigger the transformation in their descendants who carried supernatural heritage. Your mother hoped you would never need to make that choice, but she prepared for the possibility that circumstances might force your hand." The implications struck Alira like physical blows as she realized that every element of the trap had been designed with dual purpose. The tears of seraphim didn't just create barriers against supernatural beings, they provided the spiritual energy necessary to fuel a controlled transformation that would preserve her essential humanity while awakening her dormant, immortal potential. "But why court me at all?" she demanded, her voice raw with emotion as she struggled to understand his motivations. "If you loved my mother, why seek to claim her daughter?" "Because I sensed what you carried within you from our first meeting," Thalor admitted, his supernatural composure finally cracking to reveal genuine vulnerability. "The loneliness of immortal existence had become unbearable after losing Evangeline, but in you, I recognized the possibility of finding not just companionship, but true understanding between our kinds. The heart's compass pulsed with increasing intensity as dawn light began to filter through the stained glass windows, painting the sanctum in colors that spoke of transformation and new beginnings. The artifact's influence was forcing them to confront not just past deceptions, but present emotions that neither had fully acknowledged. "I wanted to hate you," Alira whispered, her hand moving to touch his face with trembling fingers. "Everything I was taught demanded that I see you as nothing more than a monster to be destroyed. And I wanted to believe you were merely another victim to be claimed and abandoned," Thalor replied, his burgundy eyes reflecting depths of feeling that centuries of predatory existence had failed to extinguish. "But your courage and intelligence reminded me of your mother, while your hidden strength spoke to possibilities I had never dared to imagine." The binding ritual had transformed into something unprecedented as the wedding ring of binding responded to emotional truth rather than supernatural compulsion. Instead of creating chains to hold a vampire captive, the ancient magic was weaving connections that bridged the gap between mortal and immortal existence. The chronicle stone in the main chapel blazed with light as it recorded the emergence of something entirely new, not the destruction of a supernatural threat, but the birth of a union that transcended the ancient barriers between species. The artifact's mystical properties ensured that future generations would understand how love had transformed conflict into covenant. As dawn broke fully through the windows, bathing both participants in light that should have meant death for any vampire, Thalor remained unharmed within the sanctum's protected embrace. The binding had created not imprisonment, but sanctuary, allowing vampire and guardian to stand together in holy light without fear of destruction. The sanctuary fell into profound silence as both Alira and Thalor struggled to process the magnitude of what had been revealed. The heart's compass of eternal truth continued to pulse between them, its crystalline surface reflecting the dawn light that streamed through stained glass windows in patterns that painted the ancient stones with colors of hope and transformation. Alira's hands trembled as she reached for the phoenix feather quill of last words that had materialized upon the altar, its appearance signaling that the moment had come for declarations that would carry supernatural weight and could never be undone. The mystical writing implement glowed with inner fire that spoke of its sacred purpose to record final wishes or declarations that bound the speaker to their chosen path, regardless of consequences. "The choice before us cannot be undone," she whispered, her voice echoing in the consecrated space as she contemplated the implications of embracing her dual heritage. "If I accept what you've revealed about my nature, there will be no returning to the life I've known." Thalor watched her with eyes that reflected centuries of loneliness, tempered by newfound hope. His supernatural composure had been replaced by vulnerability that made him appear almost mortal despite his immortal nature. "The transformation will change everything about your existence, but it need not change who you are in your heart. Your mother proved that love could bridge any divide if both parties possessed the courage to embrace what others feared." The weight of decision pressed upon Alira as she considered not just her own fate but the future of the Partis. Valley she had sworn to protect. Everything her ancestors had built depended on the choice she made in this moment, though the very nature of that choice had been revealed to be far different from what she had been taught to expect. Outside the sanctuary, Father Benedict maintained his vigil in the main chapel, his prayers taking on new urgency as he sensed the spiritual forces reaching their peak intensity. The elderly priest had served the Blackthorn family long enough to recognize when ancient powers were reshaping the fundamental nature of reality itself. His weathered hands gripped his rosary with desperate strength as he offered his faith as an anchor for whatever transformation was about to unfold. Martha and Thomas waited in the castle's great hall, their expressions reflecting decades of loyalty to a family whose secrets they had glimpsed but never fully understood. The housekeeper's steady demeanor masked deep concern for the young woman she had helped raise, while the stable master's practical mind struggled to comprehend forces that transcended his earthly experience. "Something's changing," Martha murmured, her voice barely audible as she felt the very air around them shift with supernatural energy. "The castle itself feels different, like the stones are awakening to something they've been waiting for since the foundation was laid." Thomas nodded grimly, his weathered face turned toward the chapel, where light blazed with intensity that exceeded any natural dawn. "Whatever's happening up there will determine whether we continue serving the Blackthorn line or witness its end entirely." In the sanctuary, Alira struggled with revelations that had overturned every certainty she had possessed about her identity and purpose. The phoenix feather quill waited in her trembling grasp, ready to record whatever declaration she chose to make, though the weight of that choice seemed almost too much to bear. "Tell me about my mother's transformation," she requested, her voice steadying as she sought to understand the full implications of what acceptance would mean. Did she suffer when her human nature gave way to something else? Thalor's expression grew distant as he remembered the night when love had overcome every barrier between mortal and immortal existence. Evangeline's change was gradual and willing, guided by affection that made the transition feel like awakening rather than loss. She retained everything that made her who she was, while gaining abilities that allowed her to protect what she loved more effectively. The description offered some comfort, though Alira remained acutely aware that her situation differed significantly from her mother's experience. Evangeline had chosen transformation out of love for a single vampire, while Alira faced the possibility of accepting her dual nature in order to protect an entire valley from supernatural threats that would only grow more dangerous with the passage of time. "The valley's protections," she said, her mind turning to practical concerns even as her heart struggled with emotional turmoil. "If I become what you're suggesting, will I still be able to maintain the wards and barriers that have kept this place safe for centuries? Your enhanced abilities would make you a more effective guardian than any purely mortal keeper could hope to be," Thalor assured her, his burgundy eyes reflecting certainty born of long experience. The supernatural threats that challenged these ancient protections would find themselves facing a defender who possessed both their power and the wisdom to use it responsibly. The wedding ring of binding pulsed with increasing getio, warmth as it responded to the emotional intensity building between them. The ancient artifact seemed to sense that its true purpose was about to be fulfilled, not as a tool of imprisonment, but as a catalyst for transformation that would create something entirely new in the eternal struggle between light and darkness. Alira closed her eyes and reached out with senses she had never fully understood, feeling for the first time the dormant power that flowed through her veins like a sleeping river waiting to be awakened. The vampire blood, inherited from her father, called to the moonlight that streamed through the windows, while her mortal heritage anchored her to the sacred ground that had protected her family for generations. "The transformation cannot be undone," she said, more to herself than to Thalor as she contemplated the magnitude of the choice before her. "Once I accept what I am, there will be no returning to the simple faith that has guided my family for centuries. But there will be the possibility of protecting that faith more effectively than any purely mortal guardian could hope to." "Achieve," Thalor replied, his voice carrying gentle encouragement rather than supernatural compulsion. "Your mother proved that embracing one's dual nature need not mean abandoning the values that define us." The phoenix feather quill grew warm in Alira's grasp as she raised it to the blessed parchment that would record her final decision. The words she wrote would bind her to whichever path she chose, creating spiritual chains that would prove stronger than any physical constraint. Around them, the tiers of seraphim blazed with light that spoke of divine approval for choices made from love rather than fear. The sacred crystals had witnessed countless moments of decision throughout the centuries, but none had carried implications quite as far-reaching as the declaration that was about to be recorded. "If I choose transformation," Alira said, her voice gaining strength as she prepared to commit herself to an irreversible path, "I do so not out of desire for power or fear of mortality, but from recognition that love sometimes requires us to become more than what we believed possible." The phoenix feather quill touched the parchment with a soft whisper that seemed to echo through dimensions beyond the physical realm. The first words appeared in script that glowed with inner fire, marking the beginning of a declaration that would reshape the fundamental nature of the valley's protections. Thalor watched with held breath as the woman he had come to love prepared to make the choice that would determine whether their future held partnership or tragedy. His own immortal existence had been marked by countless decisions that affected only himself, but this moment carried consequences that would ripple through generations yet unborn. The dawn light continued to intensify as the sun climbed higher in the sky, its rays creating patterns on the sanctuary floor that seemed to point toward transformation and new beginnings. The ancient chapel had witnessed many pivotal moments throughout its consecrated history, but none had held quite the same potential for fundamental change as the scene now unfolding within its blessed walls. The phoenix feather quill moved across the blessed parchment with deliberate precision as Alira began to write the words that would bind her to transformation beyond any possibility of retreat. Each letter blazed with inner fire as it appeared on the sacred surface, creating declarations that carried the weight of divine covenant. "I, Lady Alira of House Blackthorn, heir to 23 generations of guardians, do freely accept the dual nature of my blood and the responsibilities that such acceptance demands," she wrote, her handwriting growing steadier with each word as certainty replaced doubt. "Let this transformation serve not my desires, but the protection of those who cannot protect themselves." The dawn blade of redemption began to manifest as the first rays of true sunlight pierced the chapel's highest windows, its ethereal form taking shape in the space between Alira and Thalor. The sword of pure light appeared only at the moment of absolute sunrise, its presence offering either destruction or salvation, based upon the choices made by those who stood in its radiance. Thalor stepped back as the blade's brilliance filled the sanctuary, his vampire nature recoiling instinctively from light that possessed the power to unmake his immortal existence. Yet he remained within the sacred space, held by bonds of affection that proved stronger than supernatural preservation instincts. "The blade offers choice," Alira said, her voice carrying new authority as the transformation began to awaken dormant power within her veins. "Accept redemption through sacrifice, or face destruction through defiance of divine will." The dawn blade pulsed with increasing intensity as it evaluated the supernatural beings within its reach. Its crystalline surface reflected not just their physical forms, but the true nature of their souls, revealing layers of motivation and desire that neither had fully acknowledged even to themselves. Alira felt the vampire blood stirring within her as the morning light touched her skin without burning. The sacred protections woven into her wedding dress channeled the transformation's energy, guiding the awakening power along paths that would preserve her essential humanity while granting abilities beyond mortal limitation. "Choose quickly," she gasped, as supernatural forces reached critical intensity within the dome. Sanctuary's consecrated walls. The blade will not wait for indecision when divine justice demands resolution. Thalor moved toward the dawn blade, despite every instinct that screamed for retreat, his burgundy eyes fixed upon the light that could either grant him redemption or reduce him to ash and memory. "I choose to share your fate, whatever form it might take. Death with meaning holds more appeal than immortal existence without purpose." The sword's radiance intensified as it registered his decision, but instead of delivering the expected destruction, the Dawn Blade began to sing with harmonies that spoke of transformation rather than termination. The sacred weapon had detected something unprecedented, two beings choosing unity over separation, acceptance over fear. Alira reached out with trembling fingers to touch the blade's ethereal surface, her vampire heritage allowing her to make contact with light that would have destroyed any purely supernatural creature. The moment her skin met the Dawn Blade's radiance, power flowed through her with intensity that threatened to overwhelm her mortal consciousness. Her vision expanded beyond normal perception as enhanced senses revealed the true nature of the sanctuary's protections. She could see the spiritual energy flowing through every stone, feel the accumulated prayers of 23 generations humming in harmonious resonance with the transformation taking place within her body. Thalor joined his hand to hers upon the Dawn Blade's surface, his vampire nature screaming in protest even as his immortal soul recognized the possibility of redemption through shared sacrifice. The light that should have destroyed him instead began to purify centuries of predatory existence, burning away the darkness that had accumulated during his long hunt for meaning. "Together," Alira whispered, her voice carrying new undertones that spoke of supernatural power channeled through mortal wisdom. Neither fully human nor entirely vampire, but something that transcends the ancient divisions between our kinds. The Dawnblade responded to their unified choice by transforming its radiance from weapon to tool, its divine light serving to catalyze a change that neither destruction nor preservation alone could have achieved. The sword began to dissolve into pure energy that flowed through both participants, rewriting the fundamental nature of their existence. Father Benedict's prayers intensified as he felt the spiritual forces reaching their culmination within the sanctuary. The elderly priest offered his faith as an anchor point for the transformation, his decades of service to the supernatural mission providing stability for changes that might otherwise have torn reality itself apart. The wedding ring of binding grew almost too hot to bear as it channeled energies that exceeded its original design parameters. The ancient artifact pulsed with rhythms that matched both Alira's mortal heartbeat and Thalor's immortal essence, creating a bridge between their natures that allowed true unity rather than mere coexistence. The sanctuary filled with light that exceeded the capacity of stained glass to contain, spilling through the chapel's windows to paint the entire valley in radiance that spoke of divine transformation. The Dawn Blade's final gift flowed through both participants as mourning became something transcendent and eternal. The unity chalice of merged destinies materialized upon the altar as the Dawn Blade's energy reached its crescendo, its crystalline form appearing when two souls chose to bind their fates together in defiance of ancient laws that demanded separation. The vessel glowed with inner radiance that spoke of possibilities beyond anything the chapel's consecrated walls had previously witnessed. Alira and Thalor maintained their grip upon each other's hands as transformation flowed through their merged essence, neither fully mortal nor entirely immortal, but something unprecedented that transcended the boundaries between species. The Unity Chalice began to fill with liquid starlight that captured and reflected their combined nature, creating a sacrament that would seal their covenant beyond any possibility of reversal. "Drink with me," Alira said, her voice carrying harmonies that blended human warmth with supernatural authority. "Let this mark the birth of something the world has never seen, guardians who possess both mortal wisdom and immortal strength." The chalice's contents shifted between silver and crimson as they lifted it together, its mystical properties, ensuring that what they shared would bind them more completely than any earthly marriage could achieve. The liquid starlight touched their lips with flavors that spoke of moonbeams and midnight roses, transforming their very essence as it flowed through their merged consciousness. Thalor felt centuries of predatory hunger dissolving as the Unity Chalice's sacrament rewrote the fundamental nature of his vampiric existence. The endless thirst that had driven him to countless acts of darkness was replaced by purpose that elevated, rather than degraded, his immortal nature. "The emptiness is gone," he whispered in wonder, his burgundy eyes reflecting depths that held serenity instead of endless hunger. Around them, the sanctuary's architecture began to respond to the unprecedented transformation taking place within its blessed walls. Stone pillars that had stood for centuries started to glow with inner light, while the stained glass windows blazed with colors that had never existed in earthly spectrum. The chapel itself was evolving into something that could contain and nurture the new form of existence being born from their unity. Father Benedict entered the sanctuary as divine light spilled through the main chapel, his weathered face reflecting awe at witnessing something that transcended theological understanding. The elderly priest carried the chronicle, stone of memory in his arms, ensuring that every detail of this miraculous transformation would be preserved for future generations who might need to understand how love had conquered ancient hatred. "The binding is complete," Father Benedict announced, his voice carrying authority that came from decades of service to forces beyond mortal comprehension. "What has been joined in divine light cannot be separated by earthly power or supernatural malice." The Unity Chalice dissolved into pure energy that flowed through both participants one final time, sealing the transformation that had made them something entirely new, while preserving everything essential about their individual natures. Alira retained her human capacity for growth and change, while Thalor's immortal strength was tempered by newfound wisdom that elevated rather than corrupted his ancient power. Martha and Thomas approached the sanctuary's threshold as supernatural forces settled into new equilibrium, their expressions reflecting wonder at the radiance that emanated from the transformed chapel. The housekeeper's practical mind struggled to comprehend what she was witnessing, while the stable master's connection to the natural world allowed him to sense the fundamental rightness of what had occurred. "My lady," Martha said softly, her voice carrying decades of devotion as she recognized that her charge had become something far greater than what she had been born to be. "You shine with light that makes the morning sun seem dim by comparison." Alira turned toward her loyal servants with vision that could now perceive layers of reality hidden from purely mortal sight. She saw the threads of affection and duty that bound Martha and Thomas to her family, understanding for the first time the true depth of sacrifice that others had made in service to the Blackthorn mission. "The castle's protections will be stronger now," she explained, her voice carrying reassurance along with supernatural authority. "What we have become will allow us to guard this valley more effectively than any purely mortal guardian could hope to achieve." The Chronicle stone recorded every word and gesture as the new guardians began to explore, abilities that transcended anything their individual natures had possessed. Alira discovered that she could sense supernatural threats from vast distances, while Thalor found that his vampiric powers had been purified into tools of protection rather than predation. Their transformation rippled outward through the valley's spiritual defenses, strengthening wards that had protected the region for centuries, while establishing new barriers that could turn away threats their ancestors had never imagined. The Unity Chalice's gift continued to flow through their merged essence, creating possibilities that would reshape the eternal struggle between light and darkness. As the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, painting the transformed sanctuary in colors of hope and renewal. Two beings who had found love across impossible divisions prepared to face a future that held challenges and wonders beyond anything either had dreamed possible during their separate existences. 3 months after the transformation, Raven's Hollow Valley had settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and miraculous. The autumn mist still clung to the ancient stones of Blackthorn Castle each morning, but now It carried whispers of protection that extended far beyond what mortal guardians had ever been able to provide. Alira and Thalor had grown into their new existence with a harmony that surprised even Father Benedict, who had witnessed the impossible become commonplace within the walls he had served for 4 decades. The eternal covenant ring had manifested on their joined hands the morning after their transformation, appearing as a single band that encircled both their fingers when they touched. Created from their merged destinies, the artifact symbolized the balance between light and shadow, mortal and immortal, serving as protection for future generations who might face challenges that required both human wisdom and supernatural strength. Alira stood in her tower chamber as she had countless times before, but her enhanced perception now revealed layers of reality that her purely mortal senses had never detected. She could see the ley lines that ran beneath the castle's foundations, feel the pulse of protective energy that flowed through every blessed stone, and sense supernatural presences approaching the valley's borders from distances that would have made conventional warning systems useless. Another delegation arrives from the northern counties. She observed as Thalor joined her at the window, his burgundy eyes reflecting contentment that had replaced centuries of restless hunger. 3 vampires seeking sanctuary, if my reading of their intentions proves accurate. The transformation had changed not just their individual natures, but their role within the broader supernatural community. Word had spread through hidden channels that Blackthorn Castle had become something unprecedented, a place where creatures of darkness could find redemption rather than destruction, guidance rather than condemnation. The valley's protections now served to transform rather than merely repel, offering hope to beings who had believed themselves beyond salvation. Father Benedict's theological understanding had expanded to accommodate truths that his seminary training had never imagined possible. His evening prayers now included supplications for the supernatural beings who sought refuge within the valley's borders. While his blessing of bread and wine had gained potency that could nourish immortal souls as well as mortal bodies, the church authorities will eventually take notice of what we've accomplished here, the elderly priest remarked, as he joined them for their customary evening consultation. Questions will be asked about miracles that exceed conventional explanation. Thalor's expression grew thoughtful as he considered the implications of increased scrutiny from institutions that viewed supernatural existence as inherently evil. Perhaps the time has come to establish formal protocols for other regions that face similar challenges. Our success here could serve as a template for communities willing to embrace transformation rather than conflict. The castle's daily operations had evolved to accommodate their expanded mission. Martha supervised a staff that now included former supernatural threats who had chosen redemption over predation, while Thomas managed horses that no longer shied away from visitors whose nature transcended purely mortal existence. The ancient building hummed with purposeful energy as it fulfilled functions its original builders had dreamed of but never believed possible. Alira's study had become a center of learning where representatives from distant communities came to understand how ancient hatred could be transformed into cooperative protection. The grimoire's pages had been supplemented by new accounts that detailed successful redemptions and the specific techniques that made transformation possible for supernatural beings who possessed genuine desire for change. The responsibility feels heavier some days, Alira confided, as they walked the moonlit path toward the chapel where their transformation had taken place. Knowing that our success or failure affects not just this valley, but countless others who might follow our example. The sanctuary had become a place of pilgrimage for supernatural beings seeking alternatives to endless conflict with mortal communities. The Chronicle Stone of Memory now contained records of dozens of successful transformations, each one adding to the accumulated wisdom that would guide future guardians in their sacred mission. Their personal relationship had deepened beyond what either had believed possible during their individual existences. The unity imposed by their transformation had revealed emotional depths that neither had fully explored, while their shared purpose provided foundation for intimacy that transcended physical attraction or supernatural compulsion. "Your mother would be proud," Thalor said as they paused before the altar, where the eternal covenant ring pulsed with gentle light. Evangeline sacrificed herself, believing that her death might protect this valley, but she could never have imagined that her sacrifice would lead to something that could protect the entire world. The comment carried layers of meaning that spoke to the scope of what they had accomplished. The binding ritual that Alira had initially planned as a trap for a single vampire had become the foundation for a new approach to supernatural conflict that promised to reshape the eternal struggle between light and darkness. As winter approached, bringing longer nights that had once posed increased danger to mortal communities, the valley prepared for its first season under the protection of guardians whose nature transcended the ancient limitations that had defined their predecessors. The mist that gathered each evening now carried whispers of sanctuary rather than threat, while the castle's windows blazed with light that welcomed rather than warned away those who sought refuge from their own darkness. Standing together in the chapel where their individual lives had ended and their shared existence begun, Alira and Thalor contemplated a future that held infinite possibility for growth, protection, and the transformation of fear into hope. The eternal covenant ring glowed with promise as they prepared to face whatever challenges and wonders the coming years might bring to their valley and the world beyond its ancient borders. The story that had begun with revenge and entrapment had become something far greater, a testament to the power of love to transcend any barrier and the courage to embrace transformation rather than cling to familiar limitations. In the end, the most powerful victory had come not through destruction, but through the wisdom to recognize that even ancient enemies might become allies when guided by compassion rather than hatred.